so he and I, and long story short, make a long story a little shorter, an IRS agent out of Seattle worked this case together. And it grew from this speculative kind of, we don't even know what happened. And what it turned out was that this longtime smuggling organization had moved 50,000 plus pounds of hashish from a mothership onto fishing vessels who took it into Willapa Bay, which is on the Washington side of the Columbia River, just north of Columbia River. And so, and then it was distributed to New York, involving some organized crime, to Canada, to California. And we spent the next few years investigating this. And it was for a first case, it was unbelievable.
Yeah, that's a hell of a first case, yeah, right? I mean, you get to learn everything. Okay, so for the audience, I am here with a longtime friend, and I think you're going to be very entertained of what he's going to say, because he's going to talk about some stuff involving DEA that I really haven't gotten into with some of my other DEA interviews thus far. Tim is unique in my mind because he was a hard charger from the very beginning to the very end. So I really relate to his story a lot with DEA. And so let's get into it. So can you introduce yourself for me, please?
Sure. My name's Tim Schoonmaker. Was with DEA from 1992 to 2017, which is a little over 25 years. And more than 11 of that was in being assigned overseas.
Okay. And Tim, tell me a little bit about growing up. Tell me a little bit about your family. And was there anything growing up that ultimately led you to law enforcement?
Yeah, I think growing up, I don't think that I ever would have thought that I would have ended up in law enforcement or DEA. I grew up in a small Midwest town. Did a lot of sports growing up, and then went to college right after high school. Did 4 years in a Midwest college, and then immediately after that went into the Air Force, and specifically into pararescue.
And I'm going to ask you, so we're going to get into some details, but tell me a little bit about, were you a studious kid? Did you like school? Obviously you were into sports. And how about brothers and sisters? How are your parents?
Yeah, I'm the third of 4 children, and we were academically rigorous family, I guess we'd say. My mom was actually my high school biology teacher, because we only had one in our high school, so you had to take her. So my brother and I both took from her. And my dad was a professor at a local college. So,
what did he teach?
He taught physics and chemistry.
Okay, so yeah. There was probably a lot of heavy emphasis put on schooling then, right?
Yes, yeah.
What about your? How many brothers and sisters you have?
So I had one sister and 2 brothers.
And what did they end up doing?
Well, my sister was in. Long time was in development work with her husband overseas.
Okay.
in remote. She was in Peace Corps, and then she was in Madagascar for many years and doing development work. And my brother was a firefighter in California. And my younger brother was in human resources, long time in tech.
Okay. So you go to college and you join the Air Force. What was the impetus for joining the Air Force?
I was very restless in college, and knew that I just had ants in my pants. I just needed adventure, but I also, for me, from the very beginning, that was only, I needed adventure, but I needed it in combination with service. So
Mm.
it was really those two things that really, and I'm not sure if I consciously kind of put that together, but actually my roommate from college left college and he ended up going into pararescue. And that's how I found out about it. He came back to visit. And it was, for me, I remember the exact moment, place, and time that I we sat down and he started telling me what he was doing, and it was like an atomic bomb went off in my life. I was like, "That's it. That is what I've been searching for."
Where do you think the service portion of it came from you?
I don't know. I think that's always been stressed in our family from way back. Service. My grandfather served in World War One. My father in the Korean War. So that sort of service has always. I had ancestors in the Revolutionary War, even further back than that, Civil War. So I just think that it's always been part of our family to serve, and I just found that for me, adventure, although I enjoy it, when you're just doing it for more or less selfish reasons, is less satisfying than doing it when you're trying to make in service of others. So
Yeah.
I think that was just for me what really what I found important for me in my life.
Did you join the Air Force specifically going, I want to be PJ?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's the only reason. And in fact, I looked at others, looked at the Navy and looking possibly Navy SEALs, Army Special Forces, but all of those wouldn't guarantee a slot in the selection school. Whereas, and in fact, active duty Air Force would not either. You had to go all those places. You had to go in either as a general or some other thing, and then if they slots came up, which they may or may not, they would give you and you could apply for selection school. Whereas the 305th, which was a reserve unit out of Michigan, they guaranteed a slot to selection, that's all I wanted, not obviously any guarantee that I would make it through, which
Yeah.
they would never give, and I wouldn't want that, but just a guaranteed slot to selection. So um, so basically I went through basic training, and then immediately after basic training, when the next selection school for pararescue came about, which they were every couple of months, then I just waited till that one started, and then I was given a slot there.
So Tim, I've known you for over 20 years, and I've known other Navy SEALs and I've known other high-speed operators, but I have no idea, or I had no idea what PJs did until you and I started talking. So can you kind of talk about what the PJ's main focus is? What are they supposed to be doing in the field, and how do they differ from, say, a Delta Force or a Navy SEAL?
Sure. So Air Force Special Operations, which PJs are a part of, there's pararescuemen, or PJs as we are called, are now kind of split into two different main areas of emphasis. One is combat rescue, and the other one is special operations, which involves combat rescue, but also involves dealing and interfacing with other special operations teams, Navy SEALs, SF, Marine, special operations. And the PJs, our job is historically was to rescue downed aircrew or other military members from denied areas, basically behind enemy lines. And in conjunction with that, in peacetime, it's doing SAR, search and rescue in any condition. So or anywhere, anytime. So that might be anything from doing a rescue mission on Denali, Mount McKinley, as some people know it, in Alaska, or where in our area of operations, where in the team that I was in out of Portland, it would be, you'd never know if in a moment's notice you might be called to do a rescue on Mount Rainier, Mount Hood, and any of the other large peaks, or 500 miles out to sea, jumping into a ship, or rappelling down to a ship, or doing a swiftwater rescue in one of the rivers, or high angle rescue, cliff rescue on the Columbia Gorge, or
So I got to imagine, I mean, it's so diverse, the stuff that you have to know, whether it's, you got to be proficient in swimming, you got to be proficient in mountain climbing, you got to be proficient in, going down whitewater raft. I mean, are they just constantly, you're just constantly doing training?
Yes. I mean, it's the biggest fear I think for any PJ is to be called on a mission and to not be up for the task. So you have to be able to. I know when I was in that we were told that every career field has officially listed job tasks, and I remember we were told that pararescue had more job tasks than anybody else in the military. So it's things that we were required to know, because we're required to to be able to parachute, halo, high altitude, low altitude, high altitude, high opening, which means jumping out from 20,000, 30,000 feet, and then opening your chute at altitude and going in, or halo, which is jumping from high altitude, free falling down, and then you're opening your chute and accurately hitting a target. To our two different static line chutes, which we had two different types depending on. And the thing where pararescue is a little different than other special operations is our expertise in being able to, for instance, jump into very small or non-existent drop zones. So having to be able to jump both jump master, which means determining where to go out of the plane from, and being able to jump into mountainous terrain, very limited drop zones, or be able to jump into trees, into water. And in addition, with the space shuttle rescue that we were part of, both originally the mode 7, which was when we were on standby in case the space shuttle went off and the runway on landing, and like Cape Canaveral, there's large ditches. So we'd go in and we'd have to be trained, and with all the toxic chemicals and fuel and everything, we would have to be in full gear, protective, full self-contained breathing apparatus, and of course in a 95, 100 degree, be able to get to them, access the space shuttle, get the astronauts up and out all within 20 minutes. So doing that, and then we transitioned to what was also jumping in case the space shuttle went down anywhere in the world. We would jump in. To not belabor, there's for the space shuttle, we were trained to throw Zodiac. It would be folded Zodiac in a package with a submersible motor, with fuel, with our medical equipment. That would get parachuted out. We would jump after it. It would land in the water. We would land close by, go undo the package, inflate the Zodiac, and then start the motor, dewater the motor, start it, and then go pick up the astronauts, and then get them on board, treat them if they needed, and then head towards whatever the nearest definitive care was.
It's just crazy the amount of stuff that you had to be an expertise in. And let me ask you this: what is the main difference? I mean, besides the fact that you have to have an expertise in so many different fields, do you? I'm assuming you also have to have an expertise in some sort of medical background, right?
Yeah, it was. We were medics, paramedics plus, because most paramedics, civilian paramedics, really only have to treat a patient for maybe an hour at the most for definitive care. Whereas we had to do that, but we also had to be able to treat patients for 3 days, because there would be situations in rescues where we wouldn't be able to get them to definitive care. So we also had to learn more long care, medical, life-saving medical techniques and things and procedures, in addition to what most standard paramedics, civilian paramedics do. And also that most of the time, we did not have an ambulance or unlimited resources. So when you're going in on almost every mission, weight and cube, what we call weight and cube, which means how much a thing weighs and how big it takes, is very, very limited. So you have to choose very carefully what you can take, and you're very limited. So to be able to operate with limited equipment and limited resources is something that you have to be trained in and be very flexible in that.
And I'm assuming above and beyond everything you're talking about, you also have to have combat training. You got to have firearms training.
Yes, and that is as combat, because all of these things that I'm talking about also could be in a combat situation or a non-combat situation. And so on top of that, yes, and you have to be trained in entries, in patrolling, which we all were, and of course combat arms, which is a very major portion. So, and calling in close air support and all that.
Yeah. So I want to talk to you a little bit about leadership, and this is going to translate later on when we start talking about DEA. In the beginning, you correct me if I'm wrong, but in the beginning, PJs, essentially, you guys had no, you tell me, you had no officers assigned to you, is that right?
That's correct. Until it was the late, early 2000s, maybe late 1990s, when they put officers in the career field. Until that time, pararescue was first created and formed in the mid-40s, in 1940. So from 1940s until the first 50 years, more or less, plus, there were no officers. And it was kind of the way that the pararescue career field was formed was in the Air Force, you're a part of an air crew. So as part of an air crew position, it was the pilots that were the more or less the officer in charge. And so as pararescue squadrons were formed, there was our command structure as far as officers. There were no pararescue officers. Our command structure went through pilots or whoever the squadron was, who were non-PJs. And that became apparent as time went on, and especially as pararescue morphed and changed and was interacting with other special operations forces, that the lack of officers was less a problem on a day-to-day. I think we were managed very well through our senior NCOs, non-commissioned officers. Mm-hmm. But when it came to a seat at the table and deciding how pararescue was going to be used and deployed, and in relations with other special operations and other military entities, those seats at the table were reserved for officers.
Yeah.
And so as an NCO and a representative, senior NCO representative of pararescue, we had no representation at those. And so our career field really suffered in a lot of ways. So
But what was so I get the negative portion of it, but I got to imagine without having any officers, not necessarily bossing you around, right? But without having any officers, I'm assuming it was good with respect to you guys had to be independent thinkers out in the field, right?
right. Well, um, it's more organic in that most of your team leaders. Pararescue is really unique in the military, I think, in a lot of ways, which is in that when I was in, your rank meant very little. It was who had the most expertise.
Mm.
So your team leader who was chosen as somebody who had the best expertise to run that mission, and it had little to do with if they were the highest ranking person. And it went that way with a team. It was all, when you were forming a team, it was who could best do that mission. And so from a day to day, the senior NCOs who ran the team day to day had been PJs for many, many years. So whereas it's when you have officers, there's always a interesting dynamic where you will have a second lieutenant who nominally has more rank than even a chief master sergeant, the most senior NCO, but they have relatively little or no experience. And it's always been a way of accommodating that they have to accommodate that. And different teams and different units accommodate it in different ways, but it is an accommodation on how you do that. Well, the thing about pararescue before we had officers, there really wasn't that. But what we did have a problem was people making decisions on whether it was for funding, how much funding we got, or even whether we were going to be able to do a mission or not, who made that decision on whether it was safe or not, which happened several times, were non-PJs who did not necessarily understand deeply what our capabilities and could make a good risk assessment. I was personally on several missions that we were not allowed to deploy because the OIC, officer in charge, the mission commander, felt it was unsafe for us when, as a team leader and a team member, we knew absolutely that it was safe and it was worth whatever risk there was.
Yeah.
So that really, I think, has been another reason why it's been important to have well, they're called combat rescue officers. CROWs is how they're called, but they're pararescue officers.
Okay.
So,
okay. Well, let's get into your DEA career. So how do you transition from PJs, high speed? How do you decide that you're going to go into DEA?
yeah, well, I'd been in, I had been in pararescue for 8 years. And I was looking for something similar but different, a new challenge, recognizing that I could continue to do pararescue in the reserves, so that I wasn't shutting off that. And I think it would have been a much harder decision if I didn't have that, but knowing that I could continue doing pararescue and do DEA was something that made it much easier. As far as picking DEA, a friend of mine and I, who was another PJ, both decided that we were going to we kind of looked around and kind of focused in on federal law enforcement. And we looked together, we looked at many of the different federal agencies, FBI, Secret Service, Customs, ATF. And the more we looked into it, the more we really felt that DEA was coming from the same mindset as pararescue. And after spending 25 years in DEA, I think we were very correct in that certainly almost my whole career, what I really valued in DEA is the decision, by and large, the decision on what cases you worked, how you work them. There was always oversight, obviously, but by and large, that was very bottom up, and that agents made those decisions. That was not directed top down, and you will work this case, you will work that case, and how you worked it. It was really, there was a lot of trust and a lot of confidence given to agents to do the job. And if they were doing it well and they were having results, that we were pretty much left alone to do that and given the support to do that. And also, by and large, especially early in my career, encouraged to think outside the box and how to prosecute cases, how to do cases, how to investigate cases. And I really appreciated that because that's very much in the vein of what I was used to in pararescue, where you had a mission, and things were changing, things were fluid, you didn't have much information at the beginning, and you had to make decisions on the fly under pressure, which was one of the things I've always enjoyed the most, is to be able to cut through all the noise and get to the heart of the problem and be able to move forward. And I felt that way in its own way in DEA. From the very beginning, from the day I hit our office, my first office was in Portland, after coming back from graduating from the academy. It was almost literally day one. I was given an opportunity on a case that turned out to be a gigantic case, but basically to be able to run with it and do it as I saw fit.
Yeah, so in 92, when you start in Portland, how old are you?
I was 32.
Okay, so 32. So can you talk a little bit about that first case and what it entailed?
Yeah, it was funny because I walked in the office, and within the first week, you're trying to find a case or figure out what. And I think my senior partner, who came to me and said he was very busy, he had a lot of cases, he said, here's a case that I don't have time for, and would you be interested in it? And he said, it's, I kind of offered it to other agents, and they, for whatever reason, didn't tickle their fancy, or they had some reservations. And I said, great, I'll take any case. And it turned out that a customs agent who was working on the coast, he was assigned on the coast, Oregon coast, had received information on, it was very speculative, but that there was something inconsistent with a fishing boat, how they had made an insurance claim on supposedly they were out at night and had been in a collision with another boat, and they claimed insurance claim. And the insurance claim adjuster had looked at it and said, this doesn't make sense. This is inconsistent. The damage on the vessel is not consistent with a collision. All the damage was basically like going up and down, like two boats were sitting there going up and down. Well, this insurance agent was on it enough to know, well, why would two boats ever be close enough and just sitting there? And why would you, there could be, because they sometimes do that, but why would you lie about that? Well, so he, one of the things that the customs agent, which I found, which is a lesson that I took with me my entire career, was that this customs agent who had been out on the coast had gone up and down the coast and developed relationships with a myriad of people who sold radio, anything from communications equipment to insurance people to other fishermen. And he would say, if you ever come across something that just doesn't add up, give me a call and we'll talk about it. So, and that was a lesson that I came with. Wherever you are, get out and talk to people who know what's right, what's normal, what's not normal for whatever area that you're working in, because they will be able to key you in and tip you off on things that you would never necessarily see yourself. And that's exactly what happened in this case. This insurance agent went to the customs and said, this is like two boats rafting against each other, the damage, and why would he make this claim? And the customs agent said, well, what if there was a mothership and offloading something illicit onto the other one? That could be. So he started doing some background, and some of the people involved had backgrounds in some smuggling. And that's really what at that point, he came to the DEA office and said, is there anybody who'd like to work with me? And nobody took him up on it until I went. I said yes. And so he and I, and long story short, make a long story a little shorter, an IRS agent out of Seattle worked this case together. And it grew from this speculative kind of, we don't even know what happened. And what it turned out was that this longtime smuggling organization had moved 50,000 plus pounds of hashish from a mothership onto fishing vessels who took it into Willapa Bay, which is on the Washington side of the Columbia River, just north of Columbia River. And so, and then it was distributed to New York, involving some organized crime, to Canada, to California. And we spent the next few years investigating this. And it was for a first case, it was unbelievable.
Yeah, that's a hell of a first case, right? I mean, you get to learn everything at that point.
It was literally everything. And to have the customs agent had about 20 years on, and the IRS agent, CID agent, had about 20 years on. So it was just a perfect, what I learned from so many things from both of them. And what I brought to the table was a kind of a young gun who was willing, to go up and go up to Spanaway, Washington, which took an hour and a half, but drive up there after a full day of work and spend all night on surveillance up there, following people, and then drive back and pull my customs agent along, who probably was grumbling the whole way. Because after 20 years, you kind of had enough of that. But I brought the energy, the enthusiasm, and a perspective. So we all brought our own perspective. The IRS agent really taught me the importance of early on selling your case or promoting your case within the U.S. Attorney's Office, and how to present it in a way that is digestible for them easily, instead of just assuming that handing them a whole big, huge packet of case material and saying, well, you go through it and you should understand and realize the importance of this. He said, from the early on, you need to organize it. You need to have it easily digestible. So in 10 minutes, they understand and get enthusiastic about this case. And when they do that, when you go and ask them for something, they are more apt to go and help you out with it.
Who is what Is that Portland that you're working with in terms of the U.S. Attorney's Office, or are you working with Western District of Washington?
I was working originally with the Tacoma
Okay.
office.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And then unfortunately, that AUSA had cancer and ended up not being able to take the case. So then they moved it to the Seattle office, which meant that I regularly was driving the 3+, well, it could be 5 hours if it was rush hour,
Yeah.
up there to Seattle on a regular basis.
How was
3
the
hours out, 3 hours
Yeah.
back.
So how was the U.S. Attorney's Office in Seattle during those early years for you?
They were every AUSA I worked with, both in Tacoma and in Seattle, were fantastic.
Yeah.
They were some of the best AUSAs I ever worked with. Really aggressive, accommodating, and I really enjoyed working with them.
Yeah, I mean that was my experience as well, especially in the early '90s, and then it just kind of went to crap.
Yeah, and I didn't later on, because when I got transferred overseas, I didn't have that experience. But certainly, my 8 years, I actually ended up doing another big case that kind of was an offspin of the case I just described, also with Seattle. So I worked as much actually with ended up working with the Seattle U.S. Attorney's Office as much as I did with the Portland office. But I also did a lot of stuff with Portland, because at the same time I was doing this big case, I was also, which is really important, and I think is really what I think is the strength of DEA, is when I hired on, it was the feeling of DEA in general, at least in my experience, and with our management, which were all, of course, senior agents, most of whom hadn't promoted until they had 15 years or 12 years on the job. And that the importance that every agent, to be a good agent, first and foremost, you had to know how to work and recruit and work with and manage informants. That was DEA's bread and butter, more than any other federal investigative agency, was we knew how to work informants, because the feeling was that the big criminal organizations, the cartels that we were working against, were getting more sophisticated in ways of evading, like wiretaps and things like that, but that there was no defense against an informant. That no matter what, if you could get an informant in, that was the way to burrow in and take down these organizations that were able to evade through different methods, use standard wire, not that wiretaps weren't supremely important, they are, but that wiretaps actually, in conjunction with using informants, are far more effective than either one of those alone, and they reinforce each other. So the use of the informants, two, was being really first rate on surveillance and being able to surveil in areas and people that other entities might not be able to do, which we did. I think in all of our early careers, you did so much surveillance and got so good at it, and being able to do it as a team, which people don't realize is the importance of doing surveillance with other. It's like playing a team sport, in that you know each other's next move and can cover for each other without even having to say it. And it's one of the most fun things, is to do a surveillance with a team that you're so used to working with, who every single one is good, because it's so seamless. It's like, as I said, playing, soccer or lacrosse or football or hockey. When everybody's on, that everything's just flowing. It's a sight to behold and fun. And back in the day, I did numerous surveillances over a week, almost 10 days, where we would, at a moment's notice, find out information that a major target was heading for instance, from Portland down to the Mexican border, and we jump in our cars in a moment's notice, and we would be gone for 10 days doing 24/7 surveillance, living out of the car, changing. And exhausting as it was also very, very exhilarating.
How about Tim? So the informant portion of it, the surveillance portion of it, back in the day, how much undercover did you end up having to do?
And that was the third leg that I was
Yeah.
going to say
Okay.
was undercover. So those are the three basic legs that you had that form the tripod that of investigations that we did. And then on top of that, you have to know how to, run a wiretap if necessary. But those three things, if you could do that, surveillance, have informants, and undercover, if you could do that, that was the underpinnings of a good agent. So
Yeah, and I know how it was in Seattle, so I got to assume because you guys were high speed down in Portland as well, you had to have older guys just kind of going, "Hey, you got to do this, you got to do
Right.
this," so you got to cover all of that.
yes, and so, for instance, at my early, we had both in Portland, but also we covered Salem, Oregon, which was one of the most active drug trafficking areas in all of the West Coast, I would say,
Hmm.
up and down. It was really a hotbed. And we covered that with the state and local task force. And so they were going out literally 4 or 5 days a week doing hitting doors, doing search warrants, doing undercover, had informants. They were an unbelievable, capable bunch of state and locals, along with our agents who were assigned there. And although I wasn't initially assigned there, I was later. I went down there constantly to gain that experience of working informants, surveillance, hitting doors, doing search warrants, arrests, and doing undercover. And so it was, I think, for me, Portland, and I would continue to advise agents coming out of the academy, if they have a choice, to pick a place like Portland that for me was a perfect office, because it had big cases, like smuggling cases. You had the coast, you had the different cartels moving things up, but you also were given the latitude to do a lot of this stuff, which I'm not sure in a bigger office where you're given more taskings to support somebody else's case initially.
Yeah, so a lot of buy bust, a lot of quick hits, but you were still doing the long term.
Right, exactly. So
Yeah.
I got the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
And it was, excuse me, it was just so much fun. It really was. I mean, because you couldn't run fast enough to keep up. And
Let me ask you this, Tim. Did you? And I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but I know my experience in Seattle, and I think you had the same experience in Portland. What do you think about, what was it about who they were hiring during those days? I mean, I just had guys that just wanted to work constantly. And I think it was the same way for you down in Portland. What do you think it was that was going on at the time?
it was, I felt, and it's the same way I always felt in pararescue, was I did not ever want to be the weak link or seen. So you were running as fast as you can. In my mind, I was running as fast as I can just to make sure that I wasn't the slowest one. And that's what everybody else felt in their own way. And so you were egging each other on. And it wasn't, I would even say, a rivalry. It was more like, hey, I did this. And you're like, oh, that's so cool. I want to do that. And I want to. So it was supportive and egging each other on. And it was having management. I think part of it was most of our group supervisors, a lot of them were Vietnam vets who then went into DEA when it was formed, in the early mid 70s. And they just kind of had a can-do attitude. It's like, go and do it. if you make a mistake and you make it trying to do the right thing, that's fine.
Yeah.
But if you are doing it because you're lazy or you're corrupt or you're doing it for self-serving reasons, will come down hard on you.
Yeah.
There's no room for that. But don't be afraid to make mistakes if you're falling forward, if you're trying to do the right thing. So
Right.
that gave the confidence to us as young agents to go out there and to do our jobs. And the agents that I worked at, fellow agents that I worked with in Portland, and also you guys in Seattle, who we had a lot of interaction. You coming down and doing surveillance of targets coming down to Portland, where we come in and help, and vice versa. It was a very feeling of camaraderie, I think, within DEA as a whole. When you went to another office, there was just a lot of people wanting to help each other and egging each other on. And that's why, as I said, from the very beginning, I felt very comfortable, because it was in very much the same way that I felt in pararescue.
Mm.
As far as the people they hired, well, I can tell you that when I went through the academy, that almost, I think 90% were either former DEA hires were either former military or former law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
There was one that had just graduated from college, and that agent was a legacy, meaning that their parent was in DEA. So that's what the mindset was of people who had law enforcement background and military background. Whereas when I went through the DEA Academy, it was at the FBI. We were at the FBI Academy in Quantico. We shared space and dormitories and things. It was not separated like it is now.
Mm-hmm.
DEA has its own academy at Quantico, but it's geographically separated from FBI. When we went through, they were all together. And we actually got to know the classes. You got to know the FBI, the sister class, pretty well, and the people in it. And the vast majority, in contrast to our prior experience, which was, as I said, mostly law enforcement and military, the hires when I was going through the Academy of FBI were very predominantly attorneys and financial investigators. So it was a complete different mindset. And an interesting anecdote is that when I was going through, Joe Cascone, who was Donnie Brasco, had going through the academy again, because he had gotten out of the FBI, and they made him go through the academy again because he had been out for too long. So he was going through, and he was in. He seemed old to me at the time, so he must have been in his late 40s, early 50s at the time. And I got to be very good friends. I got to be friends with him. And obviously, I was like, my eyes wide, this legendary FBI agent who basically did undercover against the New York mob, and the movie Donnie Brasco is of that, and the book. He was there, and I remember him, and I hope he doesn't mind me telling this, but I remember him saying, "Tim, I like hanging out with you guys because you're like what FBI agents used to be, which was undercover, surveillance, and I just, the agents they're hiring now are just a different mindset. So I kind of feel comfortable hanging out with you guys." So.
Okay, well, let's move on a little bit. So in 2000, you decide to go overseas. Why?
It was, in some ways, I love being in Portland,
Mm-hmm.
and I could have been very happy staying in Portland, but I always felt a need to give myself a new um, kind of a bump or a new challenge. Um, in retrospect, I realized what was happening there, and we can kind of talk about that in another, you know, in another from another vantage point. But back then, I just knew that when things started getting too comfortable or too easy, I guess it was, that I needed to find a new challenge. And I always joke with people. I would say I'm like a shark. I got to keep moving forward. If I stay in one place, that like a shark, you know, it isn't getting oxygen or water moving through its gills, it will die. It will suffocate. And I'm kind of like that. I need to always be moving forward, finding a next challenge. And so I started looking. One of the reasons, actually, that I joined DEA, that we joined, my friend and I, was its overseas opportunities. DEA has by far the biggest foreign footprint of any law enforcement, federal law enforcement. I think at any one time, if I remember right, 30% of our workforce is stationed overseas. We're in between, well, when I was in, I think 60 different countries, somewhere in that range. So we have a worldwide presence, and I always, when wanted to join DEA, I think it was to always go after the biggest, baddest cartels, traffickers. That's what I always kind of dreamed of doing. And for me, that meant going to the source, and so I initially had applied and actually been chosen to go to Chiang Mai, which is a office out of Thailand. It's an office in northern Thailand, small office. I think it had 5 agents in it at the time. Again, away from the embassy, they were very independent and having to be self-sufficient because they were so far and isolated. So I was chosen for that, and then it turned out that because of some things that happened, the slot disappeared. So they said, Tim, the next one that opens up, just put in for it and you'll get it. And but in the meantime, Santa Cruz, Bolivia opened up, which was very similar to Chiang Mai in a lot of ways, in that it was a very isolated office in the eastern lowlands of Bolivia towards the Brazilian border, and it was far removed from the embassy in La Paz. And the agents there were very aggressive, very proactive, were able to operate very independently, and they demanded that their agents be able to do that. So those were really the type of offices that I was looking for. And so Santa Cruz came open. I applied for that, and I was chosen for that. And I decided, in consultation with my wife, that that's where we would go. So we packed up, and you know.
So tell me the difference between working foreign and working domestic. What are you working on? And I know that you have a unique experience in Bolivia, but in general, what are you doing?
It's a combination in every working overseas is, I would say, is drastically different depending on what office. If you're working in Western Europe, it's completely different than working in a country that is less developed, either economically, their judicial system. So in the case of Bolivia, they had just overhauled their complete judicial system. They went from what had previously been a Napoleonic system, which basically followed the French system, and they went and totally overhauled it and went to a more US system. So they had a whole judicial system that really was starting from scratch, which was very, very challenging, and also an opportunity to help form that. But in general, in countries like Bolivia and Peru and in Thailand, a large portion of it's kind of two-pronged responsibilities that we had. One was to make cases that were linked to the United States and important to the United States. But the second, which was actually more important because you couldn't do the first without the second, was nation building and developing the capacities of the judicial system and the local law enforcement, which in the case of Bolivia and Peru, they have a national police. They don't have state and local, they just have national police. So we were working, I was working in Bolivia, which I'll start with the national police, who they had what was called the FELSON, which was the basically the narcotics police. And so we in DEA worked very closely with them and were given in the day a lot of latitude, and we were very influential in working with them hand in hand. In a lot of ways, they gave us equal powers with their own police, not so much in that we were able to be at the very front of enforcement operations and be shooters, but we were there and we were in support, and we did if we had to protect life and property, in which and the other thing about Santa Cruz was we hit a lot of labs. So a lot of ours was dealing in large scale cocaine processing labs where coca paste or coca base were made into cocaine base or cocaine HCl in these big chemical labs. And most of them were in very remote places. And so we would have to go out and hit those. And in doing that, we were out multiple hours, if not days, from any definitive care. We were outside, a lot of times we're outside helicopter range because they had Hueys, but Hueys only had a 200-mile fuel range. So if we were outside that, which a lot of times we go in vehicles, if something happened and somebody was wounded seriously, we were days out, hours, sometimes days to definitive care. And that happened several times with where we had to deal with those sorts of challenges and problems.
So it's probably pretty helpful having your background as a PJ then, right?
Yes, it was. Well, helpful to other people.
Yeah.
And as long as I could have treated myself. And that was one of the things that I kind of thought about after a while is, wait a minute. So I did a lot of medical training, emergency medical training with the teams that I ran.
But how unusual was it for you to do what you were doing in Bolivia? I mean, it's much different than sitting in a London, right? Yes. I mean, you're actually out on the street with these guys, right?
Right, yes. Out in the street, doing undercover buys, if that's what it was, or hitting these labs. Or, so I had a dual roles, which I loved. Again, it was sort of the same thing as I was lucky enough to have in Portland, was that I was given the responsibility from forming out of scratch their money laundering investigative capabilities, because they had none or very little. Mm. And at the same time, we were all as agents given teams out in the hinterland. They had these narcotics teams that were out in bases that we also had responsibility to go out and serve, to train. They basically, all their training, or most of it, almost all their equipment, or most of it, to include vehicles, everything like that. Their bases were mostly built by us, all came through DEA and State Department funding. But we pretty much administered the operational side of that.
Yeah.
So it was that duel where I ended up having to wear both those hats, that was really, I mean, it was time. I just didn't have enough time in the day to do everything that I wanted to do. But to see and work with these cops and policemen that were really courageous and hardworking, in the face of really daunting odds, which when you work overseas, you really realize, and most, I think, US citizens and certainly most law enforcement, police officers, agents take for granted the protections and the little, what I call bricks in the wall that have been built over time to make law enforcement possible and to make it have any chance of success, especially against the most sophisticated and dangerous and violent threats to society, the criminal organizations. When you're working in a country that does not have those, you realize how important they are. And one I'd like to touch on, because over the last few years it's been kind of attacked and talked about, is what's called qualified immunity for law enforcement, for police officers. And what qualified immunity is the protections that police officers, law enforcement have against being sued as an individual for things that you do on the job. And in the US, you have qualified immunity, pretty substantial ones, that if it is determined that you are within your scope of duty of your job, acting in your scope of duty, and you are operating in good faith, that any mistakes or things like that were considered job and you were not liable as an individual. And there's been a push to eliminate those or degrade those in the United States from some directions. What I saw in countries like Bolivia that did not have those protections is that police officer or law enforcement officers, the cops I were working with, refused or would not do cases against the most important criminal organizations, because these criminal organizations and their attorneys could just threaten to sue them, and whether it had merit or not, these officers were threatened with losing their house, their livelihood, everything that they held dear on a personal level. And so they weren't willing to risk all that to do these cases. So what I realized, a lot of times I would see a case from my vantage point that I thought was a case that should be easy to investigate, to pursue. And I could not figure out why my cops were reluctant to do it. And it took a while to figure out, and you have to be able to, in order to operate effectively in a foreign country, first of all, you have to know their language. And language is much more important than understanding what they're saying, because the use of language and how they use it and understanding it in the way they use it or how they employ it is a window into how their mindset and what they're thinking, and to understand the culture and all those things that go into, to understand deeply the legal system and all the things that go into the legal system and allow them to do things and not. One of the biggest mistakes that new agents coming into a foreign country would be is all those things I just mentioned, they didn't understand, and they never figured out how to get to see the reasons why things weren't getting done, and to be able to tease apart and work through those issues that were the impediments. Because in order to do that, you have to, the language, the culture, and the legal system and the political system. You have to know that. And it's like for my 6 years in Bolivia, and especially the first year, it was like getting information through a fire hose. It was so much to learn, to understand before I felt I could get a handle on understanding what was going on and how to attack a lot of these problems. Um, and it really was when I really was able to make progress when I really started to understand. I always felt that as a foreign law enforcement going to these countries, that when you first go there, you're looking at everything through a thick veil, that you never really, you kind of see what's going on, but you don't really understand what appears to be going on. Rarely is what actually is going on beneath the surface or behind the veil. So slowly but surely, as you're in a country with time and effort, because it takes both, you start peeling back this layered veil, and it becomes clear to you what the true problems, what the true challenges are. So for instance, what I was talking about, the difficulties of doing a case against a certain target, could it be corruption? That's one that you always had to look at. Could it be laziness? Or could it be something else like what I talked to, which is legitimate fear of reprisals, which is either a safety issue, which in the United States, although we do an unsafe job as compared to most civilians, our job as DEA agents, because there is the force of the US government and most criminal organizations know that it's better not to attack a federal agent because all hell's going to break loose and you're going to bring so much heat if you do. There's kind of an unwritten understanding that from a criminal standpoint that we are not going to do that because it's just going to hurt us more in the long run. That's not necessarily there in a foreign country. So you have these cops who are willing to do the job with those protections that I just talked about, either not there or they're so weak that as to be a real problem. Yet what I saw over and over again is these cops, sometimes not for whatever reason, sometimes legitimate, what I talked, some illegitimate corruption or laziness. But overall, I saw cops that were willing to go forward and to go toe to toe with these criminal organizations, despite those real threats to them, both physically, financially, and otherwise. Which brings another point that I think gets lost in the whole, when people think of federal or state law enforcement, in that they think it's the US government against these criminal organizations, when in reality, what it is, it's one or two agents, maybe an office, against this giant criminal organization.
Yeah.
Unless it's the very biggest one. So that's lost it sometimes in the understanding as you think, oh, you have this big old government and all its resources, when in reality it's a couple of agents doing it and building a case and an assistant, U.S. attorney who are building the case.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because I had a court case, and I remember the judge specifically saying, Mr. Stiles, he was the AUSA that was helping. Mr. Stiles, you and Agent Gooding have all the vast resources behind you, and we're just looking at each other. It's just like, it's just us, man. We're
the ones who spent all the last weekend and the last month, 24 hours going through and photocopying,
transcribing. Yeah, exactly.
No, and I think that's really important for people to understand that, because it's taken for granted. And that's to go back to my overseas. So many of the things that we talked about, whether it's being able to do surveillance, undercover, being able to work an informant, for an informant to have the incentive and the protections to work with law enforcement. In a lot of these countries, one or all of those are not present. So wiretaps in Bolivia, their constitution did not allow wiretaps. Well, how are you, and a lot of these, if we didn't have wiretaps, they also had a very weak conspiracy law. And if you think about it, if you look at all the big cases we make as the FBI or DEA against organized crime, the cartels, if we didn't have use of wiretaps, conspiracy, being able to use informants, would we be able to make any of those cases? Or financial, the money laundering laws, weak or non-existent? Without those sort of things, virtually none of the cases against our major criminal organizations would be able to be made. So you really realize what I referred to again as bricks in the wall, which is all the things I mentioned, that through our law enforcement history, we realized we need this in order to wiretap laws, be able to do undercover, conspiracy laws, financial money laundering laws. All these things, attempt, being able to charge attempt versus just actually doing it. All these little things that in and of themselves might seem insignificant, cumulatively are what really allow the public to have a fighting chance against these very sophisticated criminal organizations.
Were you able to get some of that changed while you were there?
Yes, I lobbied. One of my things I had to do was go up, and I was dealing with the equivalent of the Attorney General in Bolivia. So I was in very high-ranking meetings, which again, that the U.S. Embassy there would allow me to do that and had the confidence to allow me to do that was very, very interesting. And on a side note, when I was there, the ambassador who was there made some very questionable decisions, very questionable, which had us really scratching our head. It turned out that he was a spy for Cuba. He was recently convicted of that.
The U.S. ambassador?
U.S. ambassador at the time, Rocha. He was a long time, while he was there, a Cuban. He had been, recruited and turned by Cuban intelligence, which Cuba was trying to gain, had influence in Bolivia, and they were trying to basically get the U.S. out of Bolivia, which they succeeded in doing.
Oh, wow.
And he had a not insignificant role in that. Some remarks that he had basically influenced the election for the Bolivian election, because he said some things that were ill-advised at the time, worse than ill-advised. It just didn't make any sense on why he would say that. In retrospect, we all see why he did say that.
Yeah. Did you have personal interaction with the guy?
Limited.
Yeah.
So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so you do your time in Bolivia. Well, how much do you do? 8 years? 6 years?
6 years.
6 years.
In DEA, we're limited to 6.5 years. 6.5 years was what we were limited before you had to come back domestic. What I found that is really important for people to understand is that DEA, who I said is in 60 different countries, we are out in the streets all the time. We're out in the countryside. We're dealing with the common folk. We have informants. We have tons of informants. So we have a different perspective, and we can get information on things that, whether it's about drug trafficking or other things, that is really a perspective that is really important, and that the State Department, by and large, does not get. Our jungle ops were much more limited, though I did do some in Bolivia. Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso, was still a big threat in parts of the country, which limited activities, and sometimes with brutal consequences. We had a police officer that we were working with, and a person that he was working with kidnapped and burned alive by Sendero Luminoso while I was there. So it could be at times brutal.